Good Saturday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for March the 25th. Today we're reading together in Leviticus chapter 14, which is the follow-up to, of course, Leviticus 13, but the subject matter is a follow-up as well, as we will be discussing the purification rituals for those who had been healed from their skin disease. Is a good place for us to pick up here in chapter 14. It's actually not the end of chapter 13, but more so what is said in verses 45 and 46 of chapter 13. So in Leviticus 13, 45 and 46 says the person who has a case of serious skin disease is to have his clothes torn, his hair hanging loose, and he must cover his mouth and cry, "Unclean, unclean." He will remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp. So because of the blemish, because of the impurity, because of the lack of wholeness that this person is currently experiencing, he cannot be within the camp. Not only is there the issue of contamination and spread to others, but also just the spiritual aspect of it, of being in the presence of a holy God, especially participating in the sacrificial works of the tabernacle. Can't do that. Those who are unwell, those who are lacking wholeness, those who have blemishes cannot do such. But if and when they are cleansed from their impurity or their disease, their sickness, then they can come back. But there are some things they need to do before they can be fully back into the group once again. It is only through their recovery that they can then go through these things and experience the readmission into the covenant community of God, which was Israel. So let me get Leviticus 14 up on the screen for us so we can read it along together. Then we'll talk about a few things that we can find here in this text. Leviticus 14, beginning in verse number 1. Leviticus 14, verse number 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses, "This is the law concerning the person afflicted with a skin disease on the day of his cleansing. He is to be brought to the priest, who will go outside the camp and examine him. If the skin disease has appeared from the afflicted person, if the skin disease has disappeared, that's important here. If the skin disease has disappeared from the afflicted person, the priest will order that 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the one who is to be cleansed. Then the priest will order that one of the birds be slaughtered over fresh water in a clay pot. He is to take the live bird together with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, and dip them all into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. He will then sprinkle the blood 7 times on the one who is to be cleansed from the skin disease. He is to pronounce him clean and release the live bird over the open countryside. The one who is to be cleansed must wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and bathe with water. He is clean. Afterward, he may enter the camp, but he must remain outside his tent for 7 days. He is to shave off all his hair again on the 7th day, his head, his beard, his eyebrows, and the rest of his hair. He is to wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. He is clean. On the 8th day, he must take 2 unblemished male lambs, an unblemished year-old ewe lamb, a grain offering of 6 quarts of fine flour mixed with olive oil, and 1/3 of a quart of olive oil. The priest who performs the cleansing will place the person who is to be cleansed together with these offerings before Yahweh at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest is to take 1 male lamb and present it as a guilt offering along with the 1/3 quart of olive oil, and he will present them as a presentation offering before Yahweh. He is to slaughter the male lamb at the place in the sanctuary area where the sin offering and burnt offering are slaughtered. For like the sin offering, the guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is especially holy. The priest is to take some of the blood from the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest will take some of the 1/3 quart of olive oil and pour it on his left palm, The priest will then dip his right finger into the oil in his palm and sprinkle some of the oil from his finger 7 times before Yahweh. From the oil remaining in his palm, the priest will put some on the lobe of the right ear of the one who is to be cleansed, on the right of his, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. What is left of the oil in the priest's palm, he is to put on the head of the one being cleansed, or the one to be cleansed. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him before Yahweh. The priest is to sacrifice the sin offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from his uncleanness. Afterward, he will slaughter the burnt offering, and the priest is to offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. The priest will make atonement for him, and he will be clean. But if he is poor and cannot afford these, he is to take one male lamb for a guilt offering to be presented in order to make atonement for him, along with 2 quarts of fine flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, 1/3 of a quart of olive oil, and 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, whatever he can afford, one to be a sin offering and the other a burnt offering. On the 8th day, he is to bring these things for his cleansing to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting before Yahweh. The priest will take the male lamb for the guilt offering and the 1/3 quart of olive oil and present them as a presentation offering before Yahweh. After he slaughters the male lamb for the guilt offering, the priest is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest will pour some of the oil into his left palm. When his right finger, or with his right finger, the priest will sprinkle some of the oil in his left palm 7 times before Yahweh. The priest will also put some of the oil in his palm on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on the same place as the blood of the guilt offering. What is left of the oil in the priest's palm he is to put on the head of the one to be cleansed to make atonement for him before Yahweh. He is then to sacrifice one type of what he can afford, either the turtle doves or young pigeons, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, sacrificing what he can afford together with the grain offering. In this way, the priest will atone before Yahweh for the one to be cleansed. This is the law for someone who has a skin disease and cannot afford the cost of his cleansing. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, when you enter the land of Canaan, that I'm giving you as a possession, and I place a mildew contamination in a house in the land you possess, the owner of the house is to come and tell the priest, something like mildew contamination has appeared in my house. The priest must order him to clear the house before he enters, to examine the contamination so that nothing in the house becomes unclean. Afterward, the priest will come to examine the house. He will examine it, and if the contamination in the walls of the house consists of green or red indentations that appear to be beneath the surface of the wall, the priest is to go outside the house to its doorway and quarantine the house for 7 days. The priest is to return, on the 7th day and examine it. If the contamination has spread on the walls of the house, the priest must order the stones with the contamination be pulled out and thrown into an unclean place outside the city. He is to have the inside of the house completely scraped and have the plaster that is scraped off dumped in an unclean place outside the city. Then they are to take the different stones to replace the former ones and take additional plaster to replaster the house. If the contamination reappears in the house after the stones have been pulled out and after the house has been scraped and replastered, the priest is to come and examine it. If the contamination has spread in the house, it is harmful mildew. The house is unclean. It must be torn down with its stones, its beams, and all its plaster, and taken outside the city to an unclean place. Whoever enters the house during any of the days the priest quarantines, whoever enters the house during any of the days the priest quarantines it will be unclean until evening. Whoever lies down in the house is to wash his clothes, and whoever eats in it is to wash his clothes. But when the priest comes and examines it, if the contamination has not spread in the house after it has been replastered, he is to pronounce the house clean because the contamination has disappeared. He is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop to purify the house. And he is to slaughter one of the birds over a clay pot containing fresh water. He will take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, and the live bird, dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird and the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He will purify the house with the blood of the bird, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. Then he is to release the live bird into the open countryside outside the city. In this way, he will make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. And then the summary statement here for chapters 13 and 14. This is the law for any skin disease or mildew, for a scaly outbreak, for mildew in clothing or on a house, and for a swelling, scab, or spot, to determine when something is clean or unclean. This is the law regarding skin diseases and mildew. And that is the reading of Leviticus chapter 14. Looking at the beginning of the chapter, we have again a picking up in chapter 14, verse 1, from where we have read already in chapter 13 and verses 45 and 46. This is dealing with those who have been declared as having a skin disease that was serious. And part of the response to the skin disease is that they need to be put outside the camp so that there would not be the possibility of contamination. So then there would not be a spread of this particular disease. Now, what we're talking about here is, again, I mentioned this yesterday, it's not curative, but it is about purification. So once this ends up happening, once the individual is able to move from the point of despair because of the presence of this skin disease, whatever it might be, to where he or she is cleansed and has hope of restoration, the whole ordeal is not over at that point. Again, there has to be some follow-up procedures that are followed in order for this to take place. So it is basically when he or she is cleansed, this is what you need to do. And in the first week of this, it's kind of a 2-week process, it seems. In the first week, he needs to interact with the priest, but the priest needs to do so, again, outside of the camp. We see this, let me see here, in verse 3. Verse 3, when the person is afflicted with skin disease, and on the day that he is cleansed, he is to be brought to the priest, who will go outside the camp and examine him. So still has to remain outside the camp. The priest will come to him, and when doing so, he would bring two live birds. This would be his portion of what he needed to bring: the 2 live birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, hyssop. He would kill the one bird, use that blood upon the other things that he has. Then he would in essence, anoint the man who had been sick at that time with the blood and such, sprinkle the blood, sprinkle upon him, put them together, and then at this point, he would release the live bird over the open countryside. This bird signifies freedom, the freedom of being freed from the ailment that this particular individual had been experiencing. But once that happened, now the one who had been healed still had some things that he or she needed to do in order to continue this process: wash clothes, shave off hair, bathe. They can then enter the camp but cannot go into the tent. So remember, we're still in setting of being out in the wilderness. But after that 7th day, now we moved on to the 2nd week, beginning of verse number 10. Now the one who has been cleaned, now he needs to get these things and go through these processes because he has been healed, so he needs to bring sacrifices in order to show appreciation for what he has done. To begin with, it's 2 unblemished males. There are quarts of flour mixed with oil. There are quarts of oil. The priest who performed the cleansing will place the person who is cleansed together with these things, again, at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest is to take the 1 lamb presented as the guilt offering, and then the 1/3 quart of olive oil, he present that as a presentation offering. Then he slaughters the male lamb at the place of the sanctuary area. He offers that up. And then there is a blood ritual that is performed as well for atonement. That is necessary here in this case as well. There's also verses 19 and 20, a sin offering that is offered. And finally, a burnt offering as well. All of this leads to cleansing. All of this leads to atonement. Again, making things right between this individual and God. So in doing so, again, this is a strenuous exercise that they have to go through. And there might be some who might not be so well off. They might be too poor in order to bring together two lambs of this sort. So there is the ability to just bring one lamb and to bring some birds as well at this point, either two turtle doves, two young pigeons, go through the same sort of process. Verse 30, he is then to offer one type of what he can afford, either the turtle dove or the young pigeon. He does that as the sin offering, and the other as the burnt offering. Again, this is all looking at what he can afford. Just because you're poor and you couldn't afford what the standard was did not mean that God did not want you. He again shows provisions, and that's one of the things that I think is really important to recognize in this text, that this is God's grace and his provisions at work in order to assimilate those who had been stricken back into the covenant community. So God is wanting them to be back in the community. He doesn't say, well, tough luck. It stinks that you got this skin disease. You'll just never be able to be a part of us again. No, they could. They just needed to go through the process in order to do so. So that's what we see concerning the cleansing in verses 1 through 32 concerning the skin diseases. We see at the end of verse 32, this is the law, excuse me, for someone who has a skin disease and cannot afford the cost of cleansing. That's for them. At the end of verse 20, the priest will make atonement for him and he will be clean. So whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're somewhere in the middle, you can be cleansed. You can be reconciled to God. You can be reassimilated back into the covenant community. Now, that's while they're in the wilderness, because in verse 33, the time frame shifts now to the future when they're in the land of Canaan and they have houses and they have mildew contamination here as well. This is an issue of purity, Again, whether it's people, whether it's fabrics, whether it's houses, wholeness matters. Wholeness matters. It's a reflection of God's holy nature itself. So a whole God desires to be a part of a people who are whole, and houses certainly played a big deal within that as well. Although I will note right now that there's no need for any sort of guilt sacrifice, anything of that nature, because the house itself cannot commune with God. This is purely about, a little redundant, but it's purely about purification. So whenever this happens, again, if they see the mildew, they need to bring it to the priest's attention. He will be taken out of the house for a time. They're going to allow it to go on, so they get examined again later on. These houses were built from stone, and then they had plaster on the inside as well. So if any of these things got contaminated, they needed to see what exactly they were dealing with. In verse 7, after the priest comes to examine the house, he examines it. If the contamination in the walls consists of the green or the red indentations that appear to be beneath the surface of the wall, then the priest has to go outside and say, all right, this house is quarantined. This house is off limits for 7 days. Again, 1 week. Upon the beginning of the second week, he comes back to see what is going on. If the contamination is spread on the walls, then they need to take the stones, they need to take the plaster, they need to get rid of all that and get it out of the house, take it to an unclean place outside of the camp, outside of the city. Well, I guess the city at that time, not the camp, was there no longer the wilderness, but outside the city. Verse 43, if the contamination reappears after they've done all of that, if they've replaced everything and the contamination comes back again, then the priest has come. He is to examine it. It is harmful mildew. The house is unclean and must be torn down with its stones, its beams, its plaster, and taken outside the city to an unclean place. And if you come in contact with it, you're going to be unclean as well. But if they come back the second time and it's not spread again, if it's not spread, then they can pronounce the house as being clean. And guess what? You do the same type of thing with this house that you did with the person who has been cleansed of the skin disease. You do the 2 birds, the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, the hyssop. You kill the one. You sprinkle the house 7 times with the blood, the water. You purify the house, and then you release the bird again. Releasing the bird signifies the freedom that the house now has from that which was ailing it. And in doing so, he will make atonement for the house. It will be cleaned. Everything will be right in its condition again. Everything will be whole at this point. And again, that is the law. Verses 54 and through 57 talk about these are the laws for skin diseases, mildew, scaly outbreaks, mildew in houses, swelling, scab spots. Going all the way back to chapter 10, the priests needed to be sober-minded so that they could tell the difference between that which was clean and unclean. That was necessary because, again, God desires to have fellowship with those who are clean. It's not just about sin, it's about these other issues as well. And again, we're looking at wanting to be whole. We're looking at wanting to be without blemishes, because that's the God who they served, and that's how God desired for their condition to be. Therefore, they needed to do that. The priest saw something was unclean, just go through the process of making it clean once again. And in doing so, again, God's grace and his provisions are highlighted, and everybody can come back together and be in fellowship again. So these two chapters really go well hand in hand, not just in the fact that they complement each other from the process standpoint, that you begin clean and you become unclean, and then you are cleansed and announced clean, but the fact that you go from being in a place of despair, because if you have this skin disease, then you can't be a part of the covenant community. You can't be a part of the people. You have to go outside the camp. Nobody wants that. What a horrible thing that was. We read in the New Testament about those issues with the lepers, and as they're described as lepers in the New Testament. And again, we talked yesterday about these skin diseases being many different things, not just Hansen's disease. But what a sad thing that was, for these lepers to be in this condition and not be able to be a part of the community. But here it is, God's provisions, his grace in not only blessing them with healing, but also blessing them in being reunited with their community once more. If you have any questions about these two chapters, please feel free to leave those in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to, again, do some research and try to figure out some more details about what's going on here. Again, this is certainly a lot that we're probably a good bit unfamiliar with, seeing how it's very foreign to us. But again, understanding these things as best we can leads us to a greater understanding of Scripture, and that greater understanding of Scripture can certainly lead to greater faith. I appreciate you tuning in on this Saturday to read through this text with me. We'll be back at it again tomorrow, reading in Leviticus chapter 15 about bodily discharges. This will be another very interesting read, but hopefully, again, it'll just help us to understand a little bit more about Scripture, about the law of Moses, and the different stipulations and facets of that law, and what it might be able to teach us about God. Again, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back at it again tomorrow on Sunday, the 26th, reading together from Leviticus 15. Take care, and God bless.